Go.
Hello to everyone who's just filing in, and good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. We'll get started here in just a minute or so. But in the meantime, if you'd like to drop in the chat where you're joining us from, it's always fun to see where people are tuning in from. Wow, we've already got a lot of people. So happy to see everyone today. And if you're just joining, some folks are dropping where they're tuning in from in the chat. So that's kind of fun. Got a lot of folks kind of all over the place. Wonderful. Even some from overseas. Love to see it. Well, I think it's already, I'm getting 11:01 my time. So let's go ahead and just kind of get down to business. My name is Heather Wilson. I'm the Midwest Save Our Streams coordinator with the Izaak Walton League. And I am happy to be joined by two great speakers who we'll hear from today during this clean water webinar about wetlands, both their ability to filter and soak up nutrient pollution and also their protections and how those protections are changing in light of some recent court decisions. Before we dive into our speakers' presentations, I do just want to do some housekeeping. The session is being recorded right now, so if you have to step away or if you want to revisit it later, just keep an eye on your inbox and we'll be sharing that recording pretty soon. There is a chat feature, which I think a lot of us have found, which you can drop any thoughts or ideas or reflections in. We also have a Q&A, which is where we prefer that folks drop their questions for the presenters. That's just a little bit easier for us to keep track of all the questions so that we can make sure that we get them answered for you. So if you haven't found that already, there's a little Q&A. It's like a chat bubble looking button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, make sure to drop those there during as they occur to you, because we'll actually take questions at the very end. So any questions for our first presenter, just kind of hang on to those and we will come back around to them. And also, before we dive in, I do just want to do a shout out and a quick thank you to the Des Moines Waterworks Clean Water Support Grant, which is in part supporting webinars like these. So thank you to our friends in Des Moines. And I think that's all I have to say. So that means it's time to kick it over to our first presenter, Dr. Maria Lemke. She is the Director of Conservation Science with the Nature Conservancy in Illinois. And she'll be getting us started with a talk about wetlands and their amazing capacity for hanging on to nutrient pollution. So I'll kick it over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for the opportunity to present some of the work that our science and agriculture teams have been conducting in the Mackinac River Watershed in central Illinois. My clicker works. All righty. So over the years, we've been working with landowners and partners to measure the ability of edge of field practices like constructed wetlands, as well as various infield practices to reduce nutrient losses from agricultural systems to our surface waters. I want to begin by just acknowledging my collaborators and colleagues. Some of them are listed here. David Kovacic and Mike Wallace worked with us from the University of Illinois. Bill Perry from the Illinois State University. Jackie Kraft from McLean County Soil and Water Conservation District. Krista Kirkham's with the Conservancy. I think she's on the call today here in Illinois. And then Terry Noto with Conservation Strategies Consultants. So I'm just going to briefly, the first few slides, provide a kind of a high-level overview of our organization, and it basically with the idea of providing context for the work that we're doing on the ground here in Illinois. So the Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, is a global organization, environmental organization. It was founded in 1951, actually by a group of scientists that were associated with the Ecological Society of America. We do operate in all 50 states in the US, as well as over 70 countries and territories worldwide, to protect both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. We manage about 8 million acres of land in the US. In Illinois, we have protected roughly around 80,000 acres. And all of this is really done, of course, through our membership, our employees and volunteers that are around the world, and many, many partnerships. Hopefully some of those I can highlight today. So in 2017, the Nature Conservancy organized what we call the Shared Conservation Agenda. This was led by research conducted by our lead scientists in collaboration with multiple universities and institutions. This process identified 5 priority areas for our work, these being land and water protection, climate mitigation and adaptation, sustainable food production and water security, healthy cities, and connecting people with nature. And as you might suspect, these have been modified a bit, are always being modified a bit, but we're still working primarily within this framework. And this has really been incorporated into currently our working 2030 goals. These are really focused on how, working with partners, we can contribute to addressing the global crises of both climate change, but also species loss by protecting both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems to increase carbon sequestration, but also to sustain biodiversity. So this is kind of the big picture view of the Conservancy's work, providing, hopefully providing some context to our work here in Illinois and how it kind of rolls up into that bigger picture. Really, the work I'll be talking about focuses on our freshwater goals around river systems, lakes, and wetlands. All right, so in Illinois, as you might suspect, a lot of our freshwater work is around floodplain restorations and wetland restorations, but a lot of that also falls within the agricultural community, working with the community to protect our freshwater resources. So Illinois is a highly agricultural state. We have about 28 million acres of land in agriculture, mostly row crop production. And Illinois also has some of those highly tile drained soils in the country. These soils here in the state were historically very wet, too wet to farm. And thus, in many cases, these agricultural tile drain systems have been installed to keep the soils dry enough for farming. And they work very well at that. But at the same time, they're also very efficient at exporting dissolved nutrients, nitrate, nitrogen, dissolved phosphorus from the farm fields to our waterways. And with an estimated 12 million acres of subsurface drainage in Illinois, the state is one of the highest contributors of nitrogen and phosphorus to the Gulf of Mexico. So nutrient losses from Illinois and from other states within the Mississippi River Basin have led to the development of nutrient loss reduction strategies for Illinois and for other states within the Mississippi River Basin. Now, Illinois' nutrient loss reduction strategy was released in 2015, and we have 20 interim goals of 15% reduction of nitrate, nitrogen, and 25% reduction of total phosphorus by 2025. And there are long-term reduction goals of 45% reduction of both nitrate and total phosphorus. So in this plan, these nutrient reduction goals were identified for urban runoff point sources and the agricultural sector in proportion to their contribution of nitrogen and phosphorus in the export out of the state. So the data shown here show that roughly 80% of the nitrate, nitrogen, and 48% of the total phosphorus exported from the state were identified as originating in that agricultural sector, which is where a lot of our work focuses on. Not to complicate things, but reaching these goals are going to be exacerbated by changing weather patterns. So a recent assessment of climate change impacts in Illinois reported that most of our gauged rivers and streams in the state have experienced increased flooding over recent decades. The rainfall is becoming more frequent and more intense during the winter and the spring months, and the changing in the timing, the frequency, and the intensity of rainfall events then are expected to increase nutrient exports to our rivers and streams going forward. So this makes it a lot more challenging to reach those nutrient loss reduction goals when you take climate change into consideration. These climate change related changes are also reflected in the most recent science assessment from the biennial report for the nutrient loss reduction strategy. This shows here that river flows have increased over the last decade. The most recent 5-year averages show the statewide river flow has increased 25% over our baseline flows. Nitrate and nitrogen have increased 13% in nitrate loadings, and total phosphorus loadings have increased by 35%. So we're not going in the right direction, and this is really increasing the work that we have ahead of us. All right, so most of this is focused in our work with the agricultural sector, and much of our research in the state has been working with the agricultural community in the Mackinac River watershed, which is located in central Illinois. This watershed was selected as a priority site by the Nature Conservancy over 25 years ago now because of its status as a high-quality river that sustains high fish and mussel species diversity. It has a lot of high-quality tributary streams that enter into the main stem of the river, and a lot of high-quality habitat that supports numerous native and migratory species of birds and also many different plants. At the same time, the watershed is highly agricultural, primarily, again, row crop production for corn and soybean. So this year, actually 2023, is the 25th anniversary of the development of the Mackinac River Watershed Management Plan. This was developed back in the 90s. It was a tremendous effort of a diverse group of stakeholders in the watershed that pulled this together. But during the process of developing this plan, primary stresses to the river were identified as altered hydrology, habitat degradation, and decreased water quality that stemmed from both agricultural and the urban sources. And shortly after that plan was completed, so different projects went in throughout the watershed. So this slide just shows where 17 different projects went in throughout the larger watershed. This includes about 9 wetland restorations. But this watershed is really, it's about 730,000 acres in size. And it was determined pretty early on in this process that by looking at the entire watershed like this, it was going to be impossible to show improvements in water quality, hydrology, or biodiversity at this scale. So this is where a lot of the work that my team and I have been working on over the years. Beginning in 2000, we initiated a series of projects working on I'll just say here, these are all on private farmlands. The Nature Conservancy doesn't own any of this land. We work with the farmers, the landowners, with our partners. And so one of our earliest projects is the Paired Watershed Project that began in 2000. And I'll talk a little bit about that today up in the headwaters of the watershed here. We also do a lot of work at the Research and Demonstration Farm in Lexington, Illinois, and I'll touch on that as well today. And then we did a constructed wetlands project in Money Creek for a number of years, which is a primary drinking water supply for residents in and around Bloomington, Illinois. So big picture for the past 20 years, we've worked with partners and landowners to implement and monitor a number of infield and edge of field practices. We've done this at multiple project sites and at multiple scales, and monitored these to better understand how well they work. These practices work to address hydrology and water quality concerns. Now, over the years, these practices have included grassed waterways, reduced tillage, filter strips, cover crops, so a lot of infield type edge of field practices, but also constructed wetlands. And so what you can see here on the right side of the slide is 2 of the very first constructed wetlands that we installed in the paired watershed, specifically to treat tile runoff. And for the past 15 years or so, our research has really been focused on these constructed wetlands, measuring how well they work to capture tile runoff, and then how well they work to treat the excess nutrients from those tiles. So a lot of this research has been conducted at this Franklin Family Research and Demonstration Farm, and this is again in Lexington, Illinois. I don't know if you can see, I'll put this down a little bit. Anyway, here we go, where that yellow square is there. So it's a really beautiful farm. This is an aerial view looking south to north. There's a Turkey Creek here, runs kind of through the farm and intersects the Mackinac River, which borders the property. There's a lot of diverse habitat. It's also a working agricultural farm. There's some remnant savanna that supports a lot of wildlife, woodland birds and different animals. As part of our work here, we restored some floodplain wetlands here along Turkey Creek. And also the farmer who farms this land put a lot of prairie, and you can see that kind of in the foreground. These are all pictures that the farmer, Tim Lindenbaum, has taken out there and documented a lot of the wildlife that this farm supports as an agricultural farm. The floodplain wetlands, we've documented a lot of river species and wetland species that really take advantage of those floodplain ponds along Turkey Creek there. Now, our specific research at the farm was designed to answer the question of how large do wetlands need to be relative to the tile drainage flowing into them to effectively reduce nitrogen and phosphorus coming through those tiles. So really, we're interested in that ratio of wetland size to tile drainage area and understanding what the most effective ratio was. So to test this question, we worked with McLean County Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Soil and Water Conservation District, researchers from the University of Illinois, and the Franklin family to construct these 3 wetland complexes we call East, West, and Gully wetland complexes. Each complex is made up of 3 wetland cells. So you can see 1, 2, 3 cells in each complex. Each of these wetland cells represents 3% of the tile drained area flowing into them. So for the first cell, then we can look at that one cell and say, okay, this is 3% of the tile drained area. If we combine those two, it represents 6% of the tile drained area. Combine all 3, that represents 9% of the tile drained area. And to make sure we have that set up correctly, we did retile the area. These red lines show where those tiles were installed to get those ratios as accurate as we could. And then we put in automatic water samplers, ISCO samplers, at the inlet and the outlet of each of those wetland cells. So we could monitor what's coming in from the field, how much water is coming in, and collect water samples for nutrient analyses coming in from the field, and then consecutively as water moved through that system, that complex. All right, so we just completed recently a 12-year study from those wetlands in these slides. This slide shows some of those 12-year monitoring results. On the left side is nitrate nitrogen. At the very top graph shows total loadings over that 12-year period of nitrate from both the east here, the west, and the Gully wetlands. So we had somewhere between 1,400 and 1,600 kilograms. That's about 3,000 to 3,500 pounds of nitrate was transported from each of those fields into the first wetland cell of each of those complexes, east, west, and Gully. But you can see as water moves from the first wetland to the second to the third, you can see that the loadings decline as that nitrate is being reduced as it moves through the system. And so the second graph shows this cumulative reductions. You can see cumulative reductions in the kilograms of nitrate increase as water moves through the system. And this bottom graph just shows the percent reduction of nitrate nitrogen as water moves through the system. So even that small wetland that represents 3% of the tile drained area, we were seeing 15 to 38% nitrate reduction, close to 50% as we got into that combined first and second cell, and not a big not a much higher reduction as we got to that bigger cell, 49 to 57%. This next graph just shows the same data, the same information anyway, for dissolved phosphorus. And so you can see loadings again decline as water moves through the system. But the main story with the dissolved phosphorus is that most of the phosphorus, 53 to 81%, was captured in that first small wetland. So that was, and not, is being held in that wetland, and you weren't seeing a whole lot more reduction as it moved through the system. So they're working really well at reducing nitrate and phosphorus, dissolved phosphorus. We're really interested in how long these wetlands are going to work. They're all enrolled in some kind of conservation, some kind of farm bill program, mostly conservation reserve program. So a lot of those contracts are typically 15 years or so. So how long do these continue to work? The top graph shows nitrate nitrogen reductions over each of these water years at the bottom here. So from water year 08 to 2022, this is actually a 15-year data set here. And this is really just for the first wetland cell. So what's coming from the field into that first wetland cell and how much is being removed in that small first wetland. And you can see that these wetland cells are continuing, here's the east, west, and gully, are continuing to reduce nitrate even 15 years later. And if we look at the 15-year average, we're seeing about a 24 to 47% reduction over that 15 years, continuing to work really well. For dissolved phosphorus, sometimes these systems may become saturated. That's a concern with phosphorus. And for the west gully system, the west wetland cell, you can see that it's maintaining and it's continuing to retain that dissolved phosphorus, starting to slow down in the first wetland cell of the other two complexes, east and gully. But even so, we're still seeing 57 to 78% reduction in dissolved phosphorus over this 15-year period. So continuing to work on retaining phosphorus and reducing nitrates. There was some additional research conducted by the U.S. Corps of Engineer researchers Jacob Berkowitz and Christine Van Zomeren. They were interested specifically on the ability of these wetlands to continue to store phosphorus, what their storage capacity was now, what it could be in the future, and how it changed as you moved from the first cell to the second to the third cell. And I'll just mention that, okay, there you go, the capacity of these soils to hold phosphorus really depends on the clay content and type of the soils, and different organic matter and concentrations of iron and aluminum, calcium that really help. They serve to absorption sites for that phosphorus. So instead of it being like nitrates converted into gas and released, and so it's a permanent solution, phosphorus is just held in the soils. But you can see that these soils, you can see these kind of burnt orange areas. Those are iron deposits. So these soils are really conducive to holding phosphorus. And what they found then was that as you might expect in that first wetland cell, that more of these storage sites have been occupied in that first wetland cell than in the second or the third cells, and that there's a lot of storage capacity left in cells 2 and 3 of these different complexes. So even though we might start seeing the signs of saturation in that first cell, there's a lot of capacity left to hold phosphorus going into the future. Okay, well, I just wanted to mention here that, I mentioned through photography, we've been able to document the added benefits of these wetlands as important wildlife for a lot of insects, frogs, plants, and other animals. The aquatic plants colonize these systems very quickly within the first couple of years of construction. And we've documented all kinds of migratory waterfowl and herons and bitterns and like black-crowned night herons and others that use these sites. So they're not only just treatment sites, but they're very beneficial habitat for wildlife. One other thing we were really interested in looking at was how nutrient export through these tiles differed between a year that corn was being produced versus a year that soybeans were being produced. And what we found was that the nitrate loading shown in this dark gray here were significantly higher in the corn production years than in the soybean production years. That really didn't see a lot of difference in the dissolved phosphorus export. When we break that down by month, what we found was that the majority of that nitrate during corn years is being exported during the 4-month period from March to June. So this represents, this runoff from March to June represents 80% of the total annual nitrate is exported just during those 4 months. So knowing this, we started looking at over the years of stacking different infield practices with the wetlands. We've been working on cover crops for a number of years, planting them in the east and the gully fields, and then leaving this west field as our reference. The other thing that we just started, we've had 1 year of data so far, is moving the east field here from fall nitrogen application to spring application. So most of the anhydrous nitrogen when corn production is applied during the fall. And so we were asked a question, if you could not apply it in the fall, apply it in the spring and side dress it, can you see a reduction in that peak those 4 months during those 4 months? This is just some of our preliminary data from that study. The top graph shows the nitrate loadings March through June in the light gray during that study versus the annual loadings in the dark gray. And so this first set here, the east side has got that got the spring application, the west and the gully both got the fall application. So you can see this is it seems to be a bigger difference between the 4-month export compared to the annual loading. But this bottom graph is really what we're really excited about. This dark gray graph on each one is that 80%, that 5-year average of a roughly 80% loss during that March through June. And the light gray then is what was lost during that year that we did the spring versus the fall nitrogen. You can see for those fields that got the fall nitrogen, there's really no difference. There was still roughly around 80% of nitrate was still lost during that 4-month period. But the one that received the spring nitrogen application was really reduced by about 22%. So we're going to do this again this fall and spring and see if we can get similar results. So I'll just mention here that the farm, again, is also a very important, we call it the research and demonstration farm site. It's an important site for outreach, and we usually average about 15 tours a year. Some of these are to smaller groups of students and legislators, practitioners, other farmers. Some of them are larger field days in the past that have hosted like over 100 individuals, where we can really highlight the different practices, but also the importance of the Mackinac River. You can see it in the background here a little bit, the diversity of the river, why we're doing a lot of this work anyway, and the connection between that farmland and those practices and the river system. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to our paired watershed work here. We have really good data from the farm that show these wetlands are very effective, at reducing nitrate and retaining that dissolved phosphorus. And our paired watershed study is really designed to understand, can we see improvements at the watershed scale? And so we have 2 small sub-watersheds we've been monitoring extensively for a number of years, close to 20 years now. Gray Creek is our treatment watershed, Frog Alley is our reference. They're both about 10,000 acres in size. They're both highly agricultural, and they're adjacent to each other, and both then flow into the Mackinac River down here where they enter into the river here. So they're, like I mentioned, they're extensively monitored. Samples are collected every 2 weeks. We have these long-term monitoring sites shown in red. These are our ISCO water samplers. These collect water samples during storm events. They kick in so we can get biweekly samples, storm event samples. We have a lot of data on just the water water quality using some YSI sondes. And then we have some MET stations set up so we can look at this in terms of how much rain was, how much rain we got, what the soil moisture is, and et cetera. These blue circles are constructed wetlands that we installed in the treatment watershed over the last 15 years or so. At the bottom right-hand corner is one of the first wetlands we ever installed. And so this is kind of how they work. So this was placed in an existing grass waterway, and that waterway, the tile water, ran underneath the waterway through that tile and directly into the creek here in the background. And so once that wetland was installed, that water then was diverted, the tile water is diverted into this wetland, and it was treated as it moved through the wetland and still distributed into the stream down below. And I'll just mention here that not all of our wetlands are 3 cells. This one just lended itself to that because of the slope. It made more sense to make 3 cells. So here's some examples of some of the wetlands that have gone in our treatment watershed over the years. You can see they're all kind of different designs, different setups. We installed 6 constructed wetlands in this watershed, and then a landowner actually worked with Land Improvement Contractors Association to put in a wetland on his property at this downstream site. So construction of our last wetland was, I think, completed 2015, 2016, something like that. And we would really love to see, water quality improvements down here at the 10,000 acre watershed scale. But right now we're focusing just, can we even see it up at the headwaters? Can we see an improvement in this headwaters, which drains about 2,000 acres or so just area. And you can see that there's one of our long-term monitoring sites is shown here in red, and there's 3 wetlands that have been placed just upstream of that. You can kind of see them here from this aerial view, 1, 2, 3 wetlands, and there's our long-term monitoring site. So I mentioned this is about a 2,000 roughly acre watershed draining past this long-term monitoring site. We estimate that's about 1,000 tile drained acres that's flowing past that site. And we have been monitoring, like I mentioned, we do want to see if we can see changes in the watershed at this kind of site here. But we've also been collecting grab samples from the inlets and outlets of 2 of these wetlands. And so here again is that first wetland we ever installed. Krista, who I believe is on the call today, has been collecting biweekly grab samples from the inlet and the outlet of this wetland for many years. And this shows some of the data from the inlet and the outlet here. And what you're seeing here since 2010 is that in any given year, we're seeing about 24%, 38% reduction in nitrate nitrogen from just in this wetland. So we know these wetlands up here are working. But again, the question is, are we seeing changes in the stream at this site here? So the next slide I'm going to show you is our data that we collected from this site in our treatment watershed and this site, upstream site, in our reference watershed. So let me scroll back here. Okay, so this graph here, oops. Okay, so this graph here shows nitrate nitrogen concentration from the stream in our treatment, which is the really dark solid circles, and the reference, which is the gray circles. And you can see this kind of seasonal pattern, which is pretty common in these tile drain systems, is you have really low nitrates here in the summertime when the tiles aren't flowing and the crops are growing and taking up a lot of those nutrients. But as soon as the crops come off the fields, and anhydrous nitrogen is applied in the fall, and then we start getting those fall winter rains, a lot of that is lost to the stream, and so we get these peaks from the fall through the spring, and then in the summer it drops down again. And some of these are really high. You can see a lot of these are above 15 milligrams per liter. Some years we even get 25 to 30 milligrams per liter during the wintertime. So one way we're looking at, are we seeing improvements in the treatment watershed versus the reference watershed, is on any given date, these are biweekly samples, on any given date we subtract the concentrations in the reference stream from those in the treatment stream. So this is what this data show here. So each of these dots here is one of those biweekly samples where the nitrate concentrations in the reference stream are subtracted from those in the treatment stream. And if the concentrations are declining in the treatment stream relative to the reference stream, we would expect some kind of relationship over time that's negative, like shown by this red line. But when we look at all the data across all the years, we're not seeing any improvements in the stream. This line is not different than 0. However, like I mentioned earlier, we found from the farm data that the majority of nitrate is lost during those 4 months, from March, April, May, and June, during those corn years. And if we just look at those dates and do the same analyses, but just March through June, we are seeing a signal. We're seeing a significant difference in that line from 0, which is telling us that we are actually seeing some improvements in the treatment stream that has the wetlands versus the reference that does not. There's a lot more we're going to do with this data, but this is a really good signal. So we are looking at stacking those cover crops at the scale of this watershed as well. So we piloted an initial study to help cost share cover crops in this upper part of the watershed in 2019, 2020. And we've been doing this for the last 4 years or so. We saw a nice increase in the number of acres until last year, when it all bottomed out for various reasons again. We're going to do this one more time this year and just see, can we actually tease out, the effect of increasing cover crops with the wetlands at the scale or not. So finally, the last 2 slides, we're starting to wrap up this research. We've been out there for a couple of decades, and we're starting to wrap up that sub-watershed research, but we're interested in circling back to that Mackinac River watershed plan. Like, where are we 25 years later at that watershed scale, and have we seen increased conservation practices, or can we even look at those original goals and assess how far we came to addressing those goals? And so one of the tools we're testing out is this ACPF tool. It was developed by ARS. It uses high resolution elevation data in ArcGIS, and what it does is at the HEC 12, that sub-watershed scale, it can identify where different practices would be most efficient. And we tested this out this shows Bray Creek, which is our treatment watershed. We tested it out in our 2 sub-watershed for our paired watershed sites, because we know those sites so well. And this is just some of the kind of information you can get from that. So it gives you an estimate of how many tile drained acres are going past a particular point, pour point, I believe they call it, where things like wetlands could go, and what that drainage area of those wetlands would look like, where other practices like grassed waterways could go based on topography and soils and all that. So we're testing this out. We're looking at if this is something that could be incorporated into a larger kind of watershed assessment that we're calling a Mackinac River Green Print. And we're in the process of looking at this kind of green print as an online assessment that takes in biodiversity data, conservation practice information, other kinds of information that really address, what is the extent of conservation in the watershed? Have we made any progress towards those original goals? Should there be new goals and new objectives set for the watershed? Are there areas of conservation or protection, in need of conservation or protection, that are not currently protected? For instance, maybe an area of really high mussel diversity that may need protection moving forward, that may be threatened. And really, one of the bigger things we'd really like to see from this is really the increased collaboration with the different stakeholders and partners that are working in the watershed. Can there be increased collaboration, understanding, and overlap of these conservation efforts to really increase and advance the pace and scale of voluntary conservation in the watershed? So I'm going to end here with these are many funding sources and many partners over the years that we've worked with. We could never have done any of this work without our ag and science team, and then Tim Lindenbaum, who took probably most of the pictures I showed you today are Tim's photos, and he also farms at that research and demonstration farm and has worked with us for outreach in the past. So I'll stop there, and I will hand it back over to Heather.
Wow, thank you so much for a very interesting and fascinating talk. So multifaceted. To be able to compare and contrast on that scale is just very cool. And I know we've got a lot of questions coming in for Dr. Lemke, and keep those coming. If they're bouncing around up here, make sure to put them in the Q&A so that we can return to those. But first, we want to hear from our conservation director here at the Izaak Walton League, and that is Jared Mott. He's going to be sharing some updates and information about the protections of wetlands across the nation.
Heather, and thank you, Dr. Lemke, for that presentation. We're going to very quickly run through some recent developments regarding the Clean Water Act and a Supreme Court case you may have heard of called Sackett v. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And some of this info is going to be, I'm sure, a review for a lot of folks. But we'll try and get through the basics fairly quickly and then hit on some of the implications. But, you know, like the saying says, every comic book is somebody's first. So we don't want to not cover some of the basics here. So I will share my screen here. And all right, away we go. So real quickly, just a little bit of an overview of the facts as it regards to Sackett. It was decided this past spring. It was one of the last decisions that the court announced in its last term. So it came out May 26, 2023. And like I said, it concerns the Clean Water Act, which was passed in 1972 with the, you know, the notion of restoring and protecting the nation's waters. And the case is really centered on wetlands, specifically wetlands on the Sacketts, the petitioner's property in Idaho, near a place called Priest Lake. Wetlands on their property, they wanted to develop and build a house. They got in trouble for developing without getting a Clean Water Act permit. And so that's how the case eventually worked its way through the courts and wound up at the Supreme Court. And the ultimate question there is, you know, what wetlands does the act protect and which wetlands does it not protect? What counts as a water of the United States or a WOTUS? That's all WOTUS means, is it's an acronym for Waters of the United States, which is how the act, the Clean Water Act, talks about which waters fall under its jurisdiction. And so the case really hinges on what kind of wetlands count as a WOTUS. Forgot to start my clock, sorry. So briefly diving into, you know, waters of the United States and where that term comes from and why it means so much. The Clean Water Act prohibits dredging and filling, which is just the way that they talked about draining and dumping pollution into navigable waters. The act uses the term navigable waters, although Congress later in the text defined navigable waters as waters of the United States. So that's where this focus on WOTUS comes from, is from the text within the Clean Water Act itself. And like I said, Sackett boils down to what waters fall under that protection, under the jurisdiction of the act, specifically as it relates to wetlands. This is an issue that's been litigated before, and you know, the courts have kind of, it's been to the level of the Supreme Court two or more than two times, several times, you know, with different rulings and different concurrences and all sorts of things like that, that sort of leave different administrations and their EPA and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to come up with their own rules about what a WOTUS is and what it isn't. Right before Sackett was decided, the Biden administration had, you know, released their rule that would determine, you know, how they were going to interpret the act to determine what a WOTUS was. And so this has been a pendulum that swings back and forth oftentimes between administrations, as, you know, each administration tries to interpret the latest Supreme Court case, you know, in the way that falls within their ideological parameters. And so the Biden administration had just come out with its definition or its rule defining waters of the United States. And then this Sackett case came along and kind of blew it all out of the water. And so we're in a brave new world here. So wetlands in the Clean Water Act, like I said, there's been a little bit of a pendulum here, but everyone on all sides does agree that some wetlands are protected by the Clean Water Act. And that's because it's in the text of the legislation when it says navigable waters and their adjacent wetlands. And, that phrase is going to be, pretty pivotal to the rest of this discussion, right? And so what happened in Sackett was the court voted 9-0. It was unanimous that the Sackett wetlands that they had, been cited for filling were actually not a WOTUS under any definition of waters of the United States. The Sacketts did not need a permit, is what the court found. Every single justice agreed to that. But then the court split 5-4 on, exactly how to define wetlands as waters of the United States. And so what the majority did was drastically reduce the number of wetlands that would be considered jurisdictional and covered by the Clean Water Act. And so the 5 justices that were in the majority here were Alito, Roberts, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Barrett. And they ruled that a wetland has to qualify as a water of the United States in its own right. And so what this means, in effect, and what they wrote in their opinion, was that a wetland must have a continuous surface connection to a water body that is itself a WOTUS. So something like a perennial stream or a lake or an ocean. And that continuous surface connection has to be such, it has to be, so significant a connection that there's no clear demarcation between the two water bodies, right? And so, this is unprecedented in the history of the Clean Water Act, that, wetlands, sort of like the ones you see in this picture here, what you have here is you pretty clearly have a river here that's separated from wetlands over here by a natural bank, or maybe there's a levee there, a small levee, there's probably not, but the natural bank of the river is separating this river from these wetlands. And if we're to assume that the ordinary high water mark is somewhere in that tree line, based on where the trees are growing, there is not a continuous surface connection here. Although I think it doesn't take a super duper sciencey background to realize that the wetlands in this photo are contributing to the water quality, either good or bad, of this river. And so the majority says, okay, some wetlands are covered, but in order to be covered, they basically have to be a WOTUS in their own right, in such that they are continuously connected to a water of the United States, like a river. And so what the minority finds is in their concurrence, which is, it gets into a weird thing of, there were no dissents in this opinion, even though the two sides were pretty vociferously disagreeing with each other. But because the entire court agreed that the Sackett's wetlands did not qualify as waters of the United States, what you would normally think of as a dissent was actually a concurrence. But in its concurrence, the minority relies on the ordinary meaning of a fairly ordinary word, which is adjacent. And I didn't pull screenshots of dictionaries or Black's Law Dictionary or anything like that into this, because I think we all have a pretty good understanding of what adjacent means. It's close to something. It can be next to something, but it doesn't have to be right next to something. And so the minority is saying that by striking so many of these wetlands from the Act's jurisdiction, the majority has substituted the ordinary meaning of adjoining for the term adjacent. And of course, adjacent is the term that is used in the Act itself. And so, I think what you have here is a picture of a pretty clear continuous surface connection. These waters are adjoining. Of course, this is a picture of a flood. This isn't, pictures of a wetland that is adjoining a river. But this is basically what wetlands are going to have to look like in order to receive the Act's protections. So that's kind of a real quick and dirty overview of what the court held in Sackett. And so some of the implications moving forward that I want to hit on briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions, are, obviously a lot of the nation's wetlands are no longer going to be protected by the Clean Water Act. This is going to lead, even though every time what is a WOTUS gets relitigated, it feels like we're trying to get to greater clarity on what is a WOTUS. Again, I don't think that this case is, going to, clear up a lot of that confusion. Something that is going to come up more and more is the loss of environmental review and endangered species consultation. And also, what does this ruling mean for the status of streams? That is specifically streams that are not perennial, so intermittent and ephemeral streams. And then finally, I think there's a brave new world here. The future of federal regulatory and congressional action when those actions are reviewed by federal courts. That I will tell you right now, I don't have all the answers for, or even very many, mostly just questions. So we'll dive into that again briefly. So, the numbers are, you can find numbers that cover a span here, but basically using this definition of, which way wetlands are going to be considered adjacent, a little more than half of the nation's wetlands are now going to be unprotected by the Clean Water Act. And the first question that comes up when you hear that is, well, what about state protections? And the answer there is that, you're not really going to be able to count on states to pick up the slack. This is a map that I got from the Environmental Law Institute, and it shows the status of state wetlands protections. And, in my PowerPoint artistry here, I've kind of covered up the key. But, in these green states, those were states that were reliant on the federal definition of waters of the United States. So once the Clean Water Act is, kind of struck down in this way, in terms of these wetlands are no longer a WOTUS, those green states are going to automatically follow that. The kind of beigey tan states have some protections, some state protections in place. And then the blue states have some stronger state protections for wetlands. But again, you can't necessarily depend on those because each state is its own universe here. And so, for example, in some states, they may have strong protections for wetlands, but they may not necessarily kick in until a wetland's of a certain size or something like that. So, the states are largely not going to be a sufficient backstop to account for the loss of these wetlands protections. And so the other part of this ruling that's going to, put so many wetlands sort of in the crosshairs here is that for the first time, wetlands that we looked at in that previous slide back there that are obviously adjacent wetlands, they're separated from a river or something, a lake or ocean, by, even if it's a man-made structure like a levee. Think of the levees on the Mississippi River, along the Mississippi River, especially the lower Mississippi River, or dunes, even natural dunes. So man-made or natural features that physically block a wetland from a water body now make sure that those wetlands are no longer protected by the Act. Even if that man-made feature is something like a levee or even a road. or, you know, a path or something like that. And so for the first time ever, those wetlands are no longer protected by the act. And then we talked about how state definition or state protections, you know, can't really be counted on in a lot of cases. So greater confusion. Well, you know, I mentioned this, and that we're always trying to get to clarifications here, a greater clarification of what counts as a WOTUS. But, you know, I think the questions that are going to come up are fairly obvious. And like, so what's the definition of a continuous surface connection? If there's a road separating a river from a wetland, but that road has several culverts under it, you know, does that count as a continuous surface connection if there is that connection there? How big does continuous mean? That sort of thing. I think that one pops up fairly easy, you know, fairly readily. That's an obvious question that comes to mind. And then, you know, what satisfies that demarcation so that, you know, there is no demarcation between the two? Well, what does that mean? And so here you see a braided wetland. It's obviously adjacent to a river or a stream here. And in some cases, it even looks like it adjoins the river or stream. But, you know, you see a lot of ordinary high water mark. You see a lot of bank here. And so does this braided wetland count as a WOTUS under the court's new definition here? I don't know. You know, this wetland's very obviously connected to this river in some places, but not in others. And, you know, so there are still things that the EPA and the Corps are going to have to try and interpret from this court's ruling that are just going to lead to confusion. A big one here that, you know, I've definitely heard a lot of folks talking about, but not necessarily everybody, is loss of environmental review and endangered species consultation. And so a lot of times a Clean Water Act permit that you need for dredging or filling is the only federal hook into some kind of project that then activates NEPA and the ESA. So when I say NEPA, I'm of course referring to the National Environmental Policy Act that kicks in, you know, all sorts of environmental impact statements and environmental assessments and that sort of thing that you have to do. And then obviously on the Endangered Species Act, you know, any federal action requires a consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on whether whatever action you're doing is going to harm any endangered species. But in order for those things to automatically kick in, there has to be some sort of federal action. So if a state is doing something or something's happening, you know, on the local level, it may not necessarily, NEPA and ESA may not necessarily kick in. And often the hook that would bring them in was that federal action in the issuance of a Clean Water Act permit. It's called a 404 permit. And so with that hook gone, there's going to be that many more projects that are going forward without these, you know, key environmental backstops. And so one thing that I would highlight is this does not relieve a developer or a home builder or whomever it may be of their obligations under the Endangered Species Act. They still can't harm endangered species. I've got this great picture. I'm from Mississippi. You can't tell by the way I talk. Got this great picture of a dusky gopher frog here. And, you know, so a developer is not now off the hook and he can just harm endangered species. But there is no automatic consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service that comes with securing a Clean Water Act permit. And so that's something they're going to have to navigate on their own now because they won't need the Clean Water permit if they're developing these wetlands that are no longer protected. And the big one here is you know, what's next for streams? Sackett is specific to wetlands, but I think the court's language and how they're talking about and narrowly focusing what is protected, and when they're using terms like, you know, disconnected or, you know, continuous surface connection, I think it's fairly obvious where they may go next if you know, they're brought a case about streams. What about streams that aren't perennial streams, that don't flow all year long? I think, and a lot of folks think that the writing's probably on the wall if the court does get this question that, intermittent and ephemeral streams do not have a permanent connection to, rivers and lakes and other waters of the United States. And so they are probably no longer going to be protected by the Clean Water Act if the court gets that case. That, of course, matters for a whole bunch of reasons, but just one of the main ones is that about a third of all Americans get their drinking water from systems that are fed, at least in part, by intermittent and ephemeral streams. Look, we all know how pollution works. It flows downstream. So losing protections for these streams would have pretty devastating impacts. And finally, how did the court get here, and how did they, overrule sort of what a lot of folks thought was pretty clear congressional intent? And so they kind of came up with something called the clear statement rule, or the clear statement doctrine. And basically what they said in their opinion was that because the Clean Water Act can inflict criminal penalties on someone, then Congress has to be basically super clear about what it is they're trying to regulate, if the threat of those sorts of penalties are included. And so despite, pretty clear language, like we talked about, adjacent in the text, and then very, very, very clear statements in the congressional record, especially from the amendments to the Clean Water Act that the Congress added in 1970, I'm going to get the year wrong, later in the 70s. The act passed in 72, 77 or something like that. Very clear statements that, from senators on the floor of the Senate saying we mean to protect these wetlands and et cetera. So the court is sort of ignoring all of that, and that's troubling. It does seem like they're sort of going out of their way to put the thumb on the scale to sort of defang environmental laws and regulations. If you pay attention to environmental law on the Supreme Court stage, this is the same kind of doctrine that they used in West Virginia versus EPA, which threw out a whole lot of the climate actions under that the administration was trying to enforce via the Clean Air Act. So what do we do? I think there's three things that we need to talk about very quickly as we wrap up here on this last slide. The first thing that we need to worry about, I would say, is protecting wetlands where we can. And there's a whole host of avenues to which we can do that. And that's making sure that, wetlands protection programs or wetlands conservation programs in the Farm Bill are well funded, and perhaps deserve even more funding. So those Title II programs like wetland reserve easements is the big one, making sure that those programs are robust. We also need to make sure we have a robust swamp buster provision in the Farm Bill that denies federal benefits to producers and landowners that drain wetlands. It doesn't prevent them. It doesn't, create a regulatory reason. It doesn't say that they can't do it. It just says you're no longer eligible for federally subsidized crop insurance or to enroll in other federally subsidized conservation programs if you do that. And then the North American Wetlands Conservation Act is another big one that, if robustly funded, can help conserve wetlands. So, these other avenues are important to make sure that these other wetland conservation avenues are robust. The other thing, obviously, at the Izaak Walton League, we're big on protecting our waters at the source, right? Monitoring to, have a clear picture of what's going on so that, volunteers, ordinary folks can then see as soon as problems start to crop up and start to say something and start to take action to get stuff corrected. If wetlands aren't protected and they're being developed, they're not necessarily going to be available to soak up some of the pollution that may come from whatever source. And so, monitors on the ground are going to have to speak up and act to make sure that, you know, problems can get corrected. And then finally, the ultimate thing, the real ultimate goal here is Congress is going to have to very clearly address exactly what it means when it says waters of the United States. And so to do that, they're going to have to amend the Clean Water Act. Congress is not in a place to do that right now. There are not the votes to do it. And so the key here is to build that grassroots pressure. There's a reason the expression is it takes an act of Congress. It's not easy to get Congress to do stuff like this. And this is something that the Congress is very divided on. But we're gonna have to do hard things. And so that starts with building the grassroots pressure to let them know that this is important to the American people. And they want to see wetlands and tributary streams protected under the Clean Water Act. So that's what I've got. I hope that was helpful for folks, and I'll toss it back to Heather and we'll answer some questions.
Thanks, Jared. And it was definitely helpful. Your clear and concise explanation has been appreciated by many in the chat. And actually, before we dive into all of our Q&A, which we will do here shortly, people were asking if there's a way that we can share the WOTUS definition that you kind of just explained, or if there's a resource of ours. Are you aware of anything that would be up to date that we could share?
So, you know, a lot of this is pulled together just from different things that we've been working on over the time. I'm not aware of any any one source that kind of puts everything together. I pulled these slides together from different sources: the Southern Environmental Law Center. I mentioned the Environmental Law Institute. Earth Justice has some really great materials on this. NRDC, I saw, had some great stuff. And then the Izaak Walton League, we've got a bunch of stuff going back as long as I've been at the league, which is like 7 years. So, I mean, obviously folks should feel free to take this presentation. It's being recorded and use that as well.
Awesome. Well, with that, let's try and use a couple minutes to get to the questions that we've received in both the chat and the Q&A. Maria, are you... There you are. So I think this first question is actually, it came around during your talk, Dr. Lemke. So it was from an attendee who has a constructed wetland that seems to have reached its capacity to hold phosphorus. And they're wondering if you have any suggestions about what can be done to increase its phosphorus holding capacity.
That's a really complicated question, mainly because phosphorus is so variable. And so like one thing we're working on now is looking at some of those other wetlands that we constructed that I didn't show data for. I try to get a handle on really the capacity for retaining phosphorus, because it's not metabolized in the way that nitrate is. Phosphorus is mostly retained, maybe taken up by plants, but then when they decompose, it's released again. So that's a really different cycle. So I don't really have a good answer on how to, if once your wetland is saturated, if there's a way, possibly if you wanted to go to the trouble of dredging out some of those sediments and putting in some new sediments with new absorption sites, removing some of those plants, but then you run into a lot of other issues, right? With the diversity and the habitat quality. So yeah, it's quite variable. And so our wetlands too, I'll just quickly say, mostly captured tile water. In fact, we diverted any other surface water around the wetlands through a buffer area. So if this particular wetland is receiving surface water, it could be that part of that could be dissipated to a buffer area around the wetland. So there's just different ways to approach that depending on the site. It's pretty site specific, I would think.
Definitely.
Not so helpful.
Well, hopefully that's some good inspiration. Kind of on a similar vein, there was a question about the maintenance of wetlands. So are you conducting maintenance on these constructed wetlands? And if so, at what frequency are you doing that?
Great question. So Krista is probably on this call. I don't know if she's still on, but she's our kind of on the ground person, really keeping track of the maintenance on these wetlands. Mostly they're pretty low maintenance for the most part. If you ours are bermed up so the surface water goes around. You need to kind of just keep the berms mowed. If you start getting a lot of woody encroachment, that's one thing. You don't want a lot of trees growing on the berms because that it reduces the the capacity of those berms creating holes and things like that. That's probably the main one. There are instances like where you get a muskrat who drills a hole through your berm. Things you got to keep an eye on them. There are different specific things to do, but for the most part, they're not that high maintenance. And I will just put a plug in for Krista's work here too. Krista Kirkham, she is working with another colleague from the Wetlands Initiative right now to put together actually a paper on maintenance of these wetlands, that stuff that's not in the NRCS manual, just things that they've run across over the years to look for. So hopefully that will be out soon and available to just the landowner, to things to keep aware of,
Yeah,
so,
sounds like a really great resource.
It'll be a great resource, yeah.
Well, since we're talking about wetlands, is there a difference in how you would design wetlands now, today, versus when you were just getting started? Like some, lessons learned, evolution, and our understanding?
Yeah, I think it again depends on what your purpose is for the wetlands. If it's just for habitat, that's one thing. If it's nitrate, it'd be different. I think for the phosphorus retention specifically, I think those kind of multiple cells seem to really work well because you can fill up one sorption site of the cell before it moves into the second. That might be a good design. We have actually, and I didn't hit on this, but we've tried all kinds of different designs, like putting in, the wetland as an S-shaped, so that water has to, it increases your water retention time, or putting in some deeper holes to hold water longer. So retention time is key. We do follow basic designs from NRCS because these are all enrolled in conservation reserve programs. So there are cost share reimbursements to the landowners for taking this land out of production. So there are specific design specifications that have to be followed for these wetlands in particular.
Gotcha.
But that's a really great question. And I think as we're looking at, I've showed just a subset of some of our wetland data, but that is one of the things as we look at across like 11 different wetlands that we've monitored over the years with different designs, different soils, different locations. One of the things we'd really like to tease out is where are they most effective? Where are they less effective for nutrient retention specifically? So, we're hoping to get better, clear answer on that.
Yeah, very interesting. I think there's one more question on the constructed wetland side of things before we turn our attention to the SCOTUS side of things. With this study kind of winding down, do you think that it will be a model to copy in other places or other applications moving forward?
I would hope so. One of the intentions of doing this work was to really put some numbers around the effectiveness of wetlands. We're also looking at the cost efficiencies of wetlands versus other practices, and really with the idea is how can you scale up this practice, its edge of field practice, and put it where it's most effective to really address kind of those nutrient loss concerns that we have in Illinois and in other states. So that is a really great question, and how to do that is still like in discussion, like what's the best way to do that. But one way we're approaching it is providing the data to say, look, they really do work, and this is how they work and when they work and where they work best, and the cost efficiency over that 15-year contract or that kind of thing.
Definitely. So, yeah, that side of the story is pretty clear. They do work.
Sure.
Well, okay, let's see. I know we've gotten some questions here about protections and sort of the different scenarios that can arise now that this SCOTUS ruling exists. So the first one, Jared, is with sea level rise, streams and coastal areas will get connected more over time. What happens if landowners upstream then block the downstream? Did I say that right?
If landowners, so
what
as
happens
sea levels rise,
I think the question gets to, as the connectivity of the wetlands changes due to things naturally occurring changes, how do we adapt our understanding of what is protected?
All we have to go off of is what the court has said, right? So if there's a continuous I don't know is the answer. What I would assume is, after this decision and reading this decision is if there is a continuous surface connection, and whether it comes from sea level rise or whatever the case may be, the oceans are very clearly a water of the United States. And so as they rise, if they become continuously connected to a wetland, my assumption is that they would then fall under the jurisdiction of the act.
Interesting. And I think some folks might have been sharing some resources on this in the chat, so sorry if we're being redundant, but is there like a resource that you would suggest, or just something you would suggest for people who are not super steeped in law and environmental law specifically to kind of consume these SCOTUS decisions?
So there's a ton of different resources. Something called SCOTUS blog, and I don't have the link. Maybe you've heard of it. Covers everything the court does, all of their rulings. Obviously, they're not all environmental rulings. They're not all Clean Water Act rulings. And so you're going to kind of have to weed through a lot of stuff there. I am sure that a Google search would find some sort of environmental law blog. If I had a recommendation for a good one, I promise I'd give it.
Well, how about the
I
Ice
don't.
Walton League's blog? Not
That
too
would be a good place to start. I am not going to pretend that, you know, I'm blogging for the league every day about what the court is up to. I certainly have and will continue to do so. But, you know, it's not going to be, you know, as in depth as, you know, perhaps others. So, but yeah, I mean, environmental law blog and Supreme Court blog, any kind of searches like that will get you where you need to go. And SCOTUS blog is sort of the heavy hitter, but again, that's everything the court is doing, not just environmental law.
Excellent. And I know we've got some questions from folks asking about sharing the recording. We are recording now. It will be shared, so look for that in your inbox, and it will also be up on YouTube, so share it with anyone who wants to see it. And I think I've hit all the Q&A. Sam, please do chime in if I missed something that you're aware of. But I think that might conclude our questions. And so I will say thank you again to both Jared and Dr. Lemke for joining us for a really interesting conversation. And thank you to everyone for hanging in with us. I know we're a little over time, but I'm going to wish everyone a good rest of your day, and thank you.